Hello, everyone. I'm Augustus Wendell, an assistant professor of the practice here at Duke University in the Department of Art History, and Visual Studies.
Hey everyone, I'm Matt. I am co-founder and CTO at Aspect Labs. Used to teach at Duke alongside Augustus. And happy to be back chatting with you all.
I'm going to give a talk today on generative AI and image production. So let's start with our slides. So this talk is in direct reference to a university course, University 103, that's being run at Duke University, titled Let's Talk About the Digital You, Technical and Ethical Exploration of a Data-Centric World. And this talk is from one chapter of that course that Matt and I are offering currently in spring 2024. So I want to start by reflecting on how we are largely a visual culture, and that visuality is a common thread that we use to communicate with each other and that we use through media to propagate ideas out into our world. And this is something that we often take for granted, but is worth acknowledging. And what I wanted to start with is thinking a little bit about what are some of the reasons why we make images, and also how we use images in our culture and in our society. We have, of course, a long history, all the way back to the origins of mankind, to the use of visual media and representation. So in this case, a cave painting with animals being recorded in visual encoding onto the cave surfaces, a way of recording interspecies relationships and reliance and narrative from very, very primitive stages of our development. Or, for instance, in this case, a medieval manuscript where the images, in this case, around botany and around plant materials, images and visuality is being used alongside text to communicate the specifics, to make certain plants and herbs recognizable. And so the visual here in these manuscripts was used to move knowledge and to share knowledge about this very specific part of the physical world and of the scientific world. Or used in religion and devotion and worship as altarpieces or other iconography and imagery that propagates narratives and propagates traditions that are deep, deep in our culture. Or in this case, a painting by Claude Monet about Rouen Cathedral, thinking about capturing the expression of light and form and space, and ways of thinking about the human condition in relation to the world around us, and how to capture that in ways that can be shared in culture. Or even in print media and in popular culture, not an art example, but a caricature of Boss Tweed from early New York. So using visuality and the tools of illustration to form a discourse, a political discourse in this case. Or in this photo from Man Ray, a surrealist photograph from 1932, capturing a certain sense of the modern, contrasting the new photographic art form with physical objects, capturing a sense of emotion and a sense of longing in this image. Or in a more recent example from Golan Levin, capturing again a sense of a person, but in this case through computational methods. So these are all just examples of visuality in our world, right? And examples of how these are present around us at all times. And in particular, these examples are leaning towards art, which I think is a very strong, rooted way for us to discuss the use and the politics around images and image making. So who makes images? Well, artists historically make images, right? But then we have photography, we doodle, we sketch, we sculpt. Recently, we have digital photography. Even more recently, on our phones, we have digital photography that's with many of us on a day-to-day basis. We share that in social media. Essentially, we are all creators. We don't perhaps think of ourselves as visual creators, but in our current contemporary culture, we largely are. So we're all engaging in visuality and the creation of visual media. So we're here today to discuss in particular generative AI for making images as a way of image production. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Matt to discuss some of the technical features of generative AI.
Yeah, thanks, Augustus. So yeah, as Augustus mentioned, we're here to talk about generative AI. Um, so what is generative AI? It's broadly computers generating images. And artists have been working with computers since uh, the 1960s, right? And the idea of using computers and generative art, at first, they started using it with kind of like simple geometric patterns through kind of like basic programming. Um, but as AI entered the scene, we really got a kind of like more expressive approach to making images. And one of the first images that was created with a network called GANs, which is dominated kind of like generative image output, is shown on the right here, right? And this was produced by Ian Goodfellow in 2014, so not too long ago. Um, and as you can see, it's, cool, but not that impressive, right? It's a little bit blurry. Um, it's hard to kind of like make out exact features. It's a little bit pixelated, but it was really impressive at the time to see a network, an AI model, produce images like this. And right, and we can kind of like liken it back to this first image on the left of the like kind of like world's first or earliest surviving photograph. So similarly blurry, a little bit messy, but a lot of potential for progress. Um, and we've seen this progress over, kind of the last 10, 15, 10, 20 years or so, right? You can see in 2014, again, Ian Goodfellow's picture on the left, and here's him tweeting the progress through 2018. And we've seen the progress in these models rapidly increase, going from kind of traditional GANs or generative adversarial network through big GANs and a model called progressive growing GANs, and so on. And these are really impressive. And you can see even by 2018, we have these really sharp images that look extremely realistic. And again, just produced by these models that were developed at the time. So artists started picking up GANs and AI models to produce work as well. One of the artists that I really enjoy is Mario Klingman. He won the Lumen Prize for this piece called "The Butcher's Son," and it kind of like exploits model failures to produce image of a figure with these kind of like scrambled, fragmented parts that were generated by a model, by an AI model, by a neural network, right? Um, and one of the things that I really enjoy about this area as well um, is that it's not really so much about the uh, realistic output of the model, but it's really about the curatorial process. When you're thinking about what images you want to train these models on. And another artist that I really enjoy in this space is Helena Sarin, who takes hand drawn sketches, some of her own paintings, some of her own photographs, and kind of like combines them all together, right? Like throws them all into data sets and then trains models based on these images. And you get these really kind of like striking outputs that I think are particularly interesting in this space.
So Matt,
So yeah,
so if Goodfellow was trying to kind of zero in or resolve, let's say, if Goodfellow was looking to resolve on a face that convinced us it was a real face and therefore was training on, I imagine, a large number of real faces.
Yeah.
Um, these other artists are intentionally pushing back. It's a really exciting way. It's like using it as a medium, right? Rather than knowing what your outcome wants to be. There's this tension in intentionally obfuscating what the outcome is and letting the system kind of participate very dynamically in not quite knowing what comes out if you're training it on not just faces but drawings and splotches and other input.
Yeah, totally. That's a really great comment. Yeah, I think, when we think about GANs early on, it was really like a utilitarian tool, right? They're used to produce very realistic images. Some of them were fed back into training data for, say, like self-driving cars or something like that, um, or kind of like for data augmentation purposes. But these artists, yeah, like you just mentioned, are really taking the opportunity to kind of like play with these tools, right? To enjoy the failure modes of these models, and kind of get away from these kind of like utilitarian approaches and use it as a medium itself. And that's something that I think is really exciting about this space. Um, yeah, so Helena does a really awesome job of this, as I mentioned, kind of like combining some of her original works um, together to create these kind of like striking images. So really quickly, I'm going to go over some kind of like technical details in how these networks work, and I'm going to do this at a very high level. You could spend kind of like a whole PhD discussing GANs and stable diffusion, which we'll go over in a second. But just to get us a sense and kind of like ground what's happening in these models, let's quickly walk through what they're doing. So at the highest level, a GANs, or a generative adversarial network, works something like this, right? So you have this model and you have a data that you'd like to represent. You'd like this model to represent. And the way that you construct the architecture is really through this kind of like generator and discriminative networks, right? That are kind of playing out this like minimax game. So like one way to describe this is kind of like a cop and a forger, and I'll get into this in a second. But broadly, looking at this diagram, uh, the generator separates samples from a Gaussian noise distribution, and its goal is to generate an image, right? Right. We want our models to be able to produce an image like the data that we're training these models on. And then the discriminator's job is classification, right? Is to determine whether that image is a real image or a fake image. And through this process and through this kind of like um, game that the generator and discriminator plays, you create a model that learns that kind of like data distribution, right? So it can produce images like the images in your training data set. And like I said, yeah, we could kind of think about this an analogy that Ian Goodfellow uses, right? The generator being the forger and the discriminator being a cop, right? So you can train this network where at each step, the generator is trying to generate, forge some say like painting or some like dollar bill, right? And then the discriminator, the cop, is saying like trying to determine whether it's a real or it's a fake based on the data that it's learned from. And the goal is to create a generative model that creates a distribution for generated data that matches the distribution of the input data. Um, so here again, we're sampling from that unit Gaussian. The true data distribution is in blue. We'd like to create a data distribution uh, that's the green one, the generated data distribution. And here the black dots are representing data points in that data distribution, right? So again, we want to create a distribution from this data that represents the kind of data in our data set. And what that allows us to do is to create images, right? Like images that are like the data in our training data set. One cool thing that you can do is take that model and kind of like sample at each point and traverse this kind of like latent space in the model, which is happening here, right? You kind of like randomly walk and sample at each point. And you're able to get this cool kind of like visual effect from it, which a lot of artists played with really early on when GANs were first coming out.
So is the idea here, Matt, that if you were to sample a particular point, you get one image of a face, but if you were to go in in a direction, in one direction slightly, you get closer to towards another face, but you're in this in between. You're in this liminal, I think it's called latent space in AI, right? So you're traversing between all these interpolated faces that are the faces that are absolutely generated. And so to simplify it, maybe if you go from the red hair towards the blonde hair, you're on a gradation between, and that's a radical simplification, but you can kind of get any shade therein along that way.
Yeah, totally. And you can do that and control for variables as well, right? So like
Hmm.
here you can traverse that space around like gender or age or hair length. Um, but yeah, you're exactly right, right? So you have these data points that are represented in this distribution that you've created. But you can sample at any point between those data points to get a new image. Um, and that's where this kind of like you're exactly right. It's kind of like this like we refer to as a latent space, but it is this kind of like liminal space between points where there exists um, some new image, right? Like some new generative image. So yeah, you can right. So you can traverse this latent space and just generate new images. You can also, right, like I said, control for features and generate it that way. And that's like pretty cool. That was like a pretty exciting space to be in as an artist, right? Because it gave you a lot of um, expressive ability. Um, but you were kind of constrained, right? You were constrained by um, by the data distribution itself, right? So if you had a data set that was just like all cars or all people's faces, all you could do is kind of like like create more cars or more people's faces, which was interesting and fun to play with. Um, but we really wanted to get to a place that kind of like took text as an input and created some output. And you can certainly do this with GANs as well, but it really took off around the time of diffusion models, and like the one that we'll play with a little bit later is stable diffusion. Um, so why do we want to do that, right? So uh, broadly because it's unconstraining for artists to be able and practitioners of any kind, including machine learning engineers, uh, to be able to play with this, right? You want to be able to like express in words what you want to see, um, and then have a model that generates some kind of like output based off of that semantic input. Um, so to get there, we'll have to take a little sidestep and talk about tensors and representation. So in deep learning, tensors are used to represent text in ways that allow the model to understand sequential data, such as like sentences and paragraphs. And you can kind of imagine a tensor as a container that holds the words and characters from the text in an organized manner, where each word is represented as a number. And these values are stored in tensors, these kind of like high dimensional representations of your textual data. Um, and the way that we go about it with models like Stable Diffusion, the one that we'll talk about next, is through the use of transformers. And transformers are unique because they pay attention to the word order, like right in the sequence of words. Um, so you do that through positional embeddings, which are then like added to each word embedding. So you can imagine like a representation of this sentence: an astronaut playing with ducklings, and then another representation for the position of each word in that sentence. And tensors are a pretty crucial step in taking information that humans can understand, like text and images, and transforming that information into something that computers can understand. So you can encode ideas and symbols and concepts into models, and then in a generative way have them kind of like output as images. So really quickly, again, I'll go over a very high level introduction of another model called Stable Diffusion, and that's the one that I think many of us are probably familiar with, where you take text and output some image from it. So this model uses a text encoder called CLIP, which is contrastive language image pre-training. And that's a transformer-based encoder that takes prompt text and converts it into embeddings. And it's trained on data sets of images and their captions, and a combination of image encoders and text encoders. So when we query this model, right, we want to query something like an astronaut is playing with ducklings, and we want this text encoder clip to encode that text and have some understanding of what an astronaut is and what playing means and what ducklings are, right? So that's cool. We are able to use this model to encode this sentence, but we also kind of want, a way to generate images from it, right? Like you can use Clip as a kind of like pseudo search engine, um, where you are retrieving images from some kind of like image data set that you find tuned it on. But really, we want to like in this instance go through an image generation process as well, right? So now let's talk about the image generation part. So again, at a really high level, we want to train a diffusion model. And there are really kind of like two parts to a diffusion model. There's a forward diffusion process and a reverse diffusion process, where the forward process takes this kind of like Gaussian noise, right? It's very kind of like similar to GANs in some ways. Um, and it adds noise to the image. And then the reverse diffusion process removes that noise from the image. So what we want to do is have a model that can essentially take an image, um, blur it, and then recreate it. And in that way, it learns this kind of like representation.
Can I ask a
So
question,
this,
Matt?
yeah,
So the nature of the noise being what seems to be the midpoint in the process. So the images are taken and turned into noise, and then on the output, they're taken from noise and turned into images. Is is it reasonable to think of this that the noise is kind of an equivalent state for everything? That it reaches kind of a perfect indeterminable state as pure noise, and therefore anything could result from that. Is the system's going to cater it and going to kind of elicit something, but it feels like every image that's put in ends up getting resolved into a kind of similar interstitial nothingness.
yeah, totally. Yeah. So it's a way for the model to be able to learn these representations. So like at each step, we want to like add a little bit more noise to the image. And then we want at in the reverse process, we want to remove that noise until the model learns to kind of like recreate that image from it. It's a way of kind of like teaching models to represent uh, the kind of images that are input into it.
Got it.
Yeah. So this model takes token embeddings from clip uh, along with an array of inputs and produces a denoise output. Right. And this happens, like I just mentioned, through this series of like iterative steps where each step processes an input latent tensor and produces some latent space tensor that better represents that input text that's coming into the model. And then we want to use an autoencoder, right? And this autoencoder creates a kind of like final image. It takes a final denoised latent output from this kind of like UNet model and converts it into an image that represents the text. So again, we have this text encoder called, and here we're using clip. Um, it's a transformer-based text encoder. It takes the text and converts it to embeddings that represent the text. We pass it through UNet, and then we pass it to an autoencoder. Um, and through this approach, we're able to, again, like take these kind of like semantic representations and create some image output from it. And the output from these are pretty striking. It's been really exciting to kind of see the progress in the kind of like stable diffusion world. I think we'll get a chance to play with it in just a second. So I'll hand it back over to Augustus to take us on from here.
Thanks, Matt. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the role of prompts and language in images, since that's so central in this clip process of identifying where in space to kind of begin the extraction of whatever the new synthetic image is. And I think it's important that we disentangle image description from image meaning, and that's really a central point when we're using generative AI for, let's say, making art, making something of consequence, that there's often a differentiation, and our prompt may be more description and less meaning, and that there's some work to be done on our end in understanding that. So I'm going to return to a few examples from the art world, and I'm going to use them as case studies here. So we have here a painting by Andy Warhol, 1964, a Campbell soup can. Um, we could describe it for a prompt if we were thinking. And, Matt, this brings me back to a question that I didn't ask early, and I'm not sure we have time to dive into this, but the captioning of the images used to train, who's captioning and who's deciding what language to use when ingesting images is a really weighty topic. So for instance, does the system know what a Campbell's soup can is? Has it seen those? Is that the language that I can use? This is not a photograph of a Campbell's soup can. This is an illustration. It looks very much like an advertising print, which was quite intentional at the time. Um, so if I wanted to describe it, my prompt might include an illustration of a Campbell's tomato soup can on a white background in a very graphic manner or style. But that's quite different than the meaning of this image. So the meaning is entangled with what was happening in 1964 in Andy Warhol's factory, what was happening in pop art and the elevation of something that was very simple, that was not a classically picturesque object or something that seen a value worth painting, and yet it was put onto canvas. Another example is this Cindy Sherman photograph from her Untitled Film Stills series, number 10 from 1978. If we had to describe this in a prompt, is it a strong woman kneeling on the ground with a bag of groceries that is torn open in a kitchen on a wood floor? Very, very specific visual cues of what we're seeing to create this. And yet that's not the meaning. We have to operate somehow between the description and the meaning. And what might the meaning be? Is it about defiance? Is it about the gender roles within relationships at this point in time? Or really, this whole series is about not only that, but that cast into the history of cinema. So this is about staging film stills for films that don't exist, about archetypes, about kind of about the strong, defiant woman who's standing up for herself, perhaps, or who's being subjected to some form of violence or some domestic relationship. And again, we have to disentangle those. So when we're looking to make images of consequence, we often can't rely purely on the description, and that the prompt can't be only descriptive, or maybe the prompt needs to be descriptive, but we have to have done some deep work on our end to prepare the language. And Matt, you brought up the term curatorial, and I think when we pop in to Stable Diffusion, we can get that sense of it's not always that we're making a single image, but that we're exploring it as a tool. And that's part of what makes generative AI so exciting, is that there are infinitesimal number of images in these encoded spaces, and we can tour, we can walk, we can make changes and explore in a way that's very efficient if we have the computing resources to manage those. Whereas when Cindy Sherman was taking this photograph, this is staged, this is on a set, this is her being put into makeup and costume, and there's an enormous amount of work that's being done to produce this single image in 1978 on photographic film that is quite distinct from our process with Gen AI. Or this image, which is a Turner image from an estate in England from 1829. Would we describe it as perhaps we'd say a painting, a landscape painting of trees, of stags and fighting bucks in the foreground, with a sunset sky? It's getting very subjective how we describe this, and that kind of brings me back to my earlier question of who makes those decisions when images are being captioned to be ingested. How does a system like this learn to associate painting, sunset, stags, trees, emotion, atmosphere, fog, haze, all the sorts of descriptive terms we might use to conjure this up? Or does it also have the meaning of it's an image that was commissioned for a very, very wealthy patron who wanted to celebrate an estate where the landscape was being manipulated deeply in emerging traditions, in England about landscape design and the picturesque and forcing the picturesque and being able to provide land that was suitable for these fighting bucks in the foreground, and that this was kind of an over-the-top display of ostentatious wealth to be able to have this space and then to have it cataloged and painted and put into posterity by Turner. Or this image that we might describe as a illustrated, I don't know, would we call it a map? Would we call it an image? Maybe we'd say it's an aerial image, a bird's eye view. This is an engraving of the city of Durham from 1891, and it can be described all of those ways, but the meaning of the image, the reason why it was made, and the reason why the bounds of the city were determined to be that top point, that low point, that left, that right, was very political, to center commerce, to center the type of production, the type of wealth and specific landmarks that wanted to be communicated about Durham. And because this is a piece of print media, rather than in our last example, a painting that is quite unique and only one exists of, this piece of media can be propaganda that's duplicated and that's sent out widely into the world. And how we begin to, if we want to arrive at a similar piece, how we manage that process, how we prompt for that. Again, I think that's where it gets very exciting as an image maker, to be an active agent working in concert, right? We're working with a Gen AI. We're not separated. Our prompt engineering, our language that we're using is responding to our needs and our desires to make images. Another thing that we might put a pin in here in the conversation is ideas of style and aesthetics, and being able to, when a system knows enough about illustration or enough about Turner paintings or enough about Cindy Sherman photographs, that we could begin to potentially use that language, which is, I think, a really thorny issue of, is that appropriate? And even more thorny, have artists given their approval to have their names used to allow systems to roll out their aesthetics in very open-ended Gen AI systems? Or this image from Carlton Watkins, which is an early photograph of Yosemite. We could describe it maybe by its color. It's a sepia-toned image, a monotone image. It has, it lightens in the distance with a sense of atmosphere. It has specific geographies of cliff faces and mountain faces and a river or a stream in the foreground. We could describe in quite detailed way all of the features that we're seeing here. And yet what we can't really capture is that at this point in time, the American West, the kind of wild American West that was largely mysterious decades before, was being threatened by development, and that these pictures were taken at a very particular geographic site that was then communicated from the west coast of the US to the east coast, and initiated some of the first legislation around national parks and the need to preserve the wilderness and identity of the country through the type of geography that we're seeing here. And that is difficult to capture in pure language as a prompt. Or this image, the Treachery of Images by Magritte, 1929. It's a painting of a pipe, and yet it also says this is not a pipe, and it is a reflection upon how do we understand semiotics and objects and images and visuality. It is not actually the thing, it is just a representation of the thing. So generative AI, it's a new medium of expression, right? And what is it suited for? This is what's most exciting here. And much like photography in the late 19th century, when photography was just emerging, it was challenging to have it accepted as an art form. It was often seen as being scientific rather than expressive, rather than creative. It was capturing only an absolute reality, whereas painting and drawing and sculpture were interpretive, and the artist played a deep role in mediating that interpretation and managing it to create the output. Photography was often seen as not artistic, and it took many decades for it to become accepted. And I think we're in a similar place with Gen AI, though things are moving far faster now than they did in the past. And so just a few um, meditative images on that. So yes, photography is capturing very scientifically what is in frame through a scientific process. But if you use the time and the exposure, and of course the direction and framing of the image, you can create very powerful works that are not in any way only scientific, but are capturing humanity and movement and passage and critiquing society and space. Another Cindy Sherman critiquing cinema and urbanity and the role of young women moving to cities adjacent to commerce on waterfronts, to the way we perceive um, cathedrals. So I wanted to just shift here and talk about a prompt that I used in a class just last week. We have a course on digital imaging is using Gen AI and using Stable Diffusion and a few other algorithms. And when generating the prompt or the brief, which is another way to say the assignment, I was revisiting Roadside Picnic and the idea of, which is a Russian novel, science fiction novel about objects and alien spaces and objects that are of our world, but are unfamiliar. And the prompt evolved to be about foreign bodies, and the notion being that we can use a system like Gen AI to make pictures that are similar to our world because they're trained on data from our world, and yet allow us to achieve the unbelievable. Much like the astronaut playing with ducks, we could perhaps tell a story of an object entering the atmosphere with a star field behind and fiery explosions emanating from it, falling through the clouds with streaks of debris flying off of this. So the notion here is, as an example, what would an object be like that came from above? And how can Gen AI be used to make some series of synthetic photographic exploratory images, a sequence of images that we wouldn't easily be able to capture otherwise? Falls behind clouds, getting lower with blue skies beyond and smoke streaks to where it falls and begins to disintegrate and become more specific and more physical until we see it as an object on the ground, or an object like this in a field of many objects, or an object lying on a beach. And I think, Matt, this gets to your point. I think you used the word startling earlier, how startlingly kind of compelling the results can be. And when I look at this image has artifacts of photography that are undeniable. It has depth of field. The foreground at the base of the image is blurred out in a way that we're quite used to seeing in photography. Likewise, the background is blurred out and has knowledge about how to expose skies and environments in this bleached desert or beach environment. And it knows when I prompt it for shiny reflective metal and fractured pieces, it can place that into the scene and then know enough about the relationship of how that object in this environment with shadows would be cast. And I don't mean to speak of it as the system is intentionally placing these, but it has a conception that it can point to, right, through this clip system, that it can point to in this latent space. But perhaps I should just pull up Gen AI and we can kind of work together and come up with some example content. How does that sound?
Yeah, totally. And I'll say before we jump into that, it is also startling to see um, Gen AI used in this way, in such a like compelling kind of approach. I
Mm,
think like when I look around at the space right now, it's very much when we talked about it in comparison to kind of like early photography, very much kind of like in its infancy, right?
mm.
Where a lot of the work that's being produced right now, the artwork, is really um, very very simple and very like didactic and not particularly expressive. And I think like people are struggling to try to move outside of kind of like strict representation into kind of kind of like the space that you're working in. So it's really exciting to see stable diffusion and Gen AI used in a way that goes beyond kind of like a classic like representation approach.
Let me just show one. I can't help myself. I'm going to show just a few brief images from another project. This is a flag, a project on new transnational identities through flag graphics. So what what would a flag be if certain symbolic content is used to generate it? So in this case, if it's about, and this came from a prompt for the Malta Biennale, Malta being in the Mediterranean, right, right deeply along the problematic migrant route from North Africa to Europe. So what if we were to make not, I'm not Algerian, I'm not Sudanese, I'm not Italian, but I'm somehow someone who uses the sea to move, or I'm someone who is a Pan-Asian. Um, Part of my identity is ginkgo, part of my identity is cherry blossom, or again, part of my identity is boats and movement and occupation in the ocean, um, and ways of navigating, and kind of myself as a figure moving and transporting through the across borders. What would some flags be? And so this is using Stable Diffusion to really lean into those prompts of what happens if it's a collage of these words and these terms that are often very politically loaded to create images that are, in this case, intentionally not photographic, but being more solid color graphics. But let's pull up Stable Diffusion and see what we can do. So I've got a Stable Diffusion model running here locally, and I've got a text to image where I can add in my prompt and add in my negative prompt if I want to kind of push back on the system. So maybe we should just experiment here. Do you have some ideas, Matt, or do you want me to drop something in?
Actually, yeah, wanted to ask you, looking at the flag images that you pulled
Yeah.
up, which are really striking and very different than what I see coming out of like many stable diffusion models. Can you talk a little bit about your approach to prompting? Like, where did you start? How did you iterate on it? What did that kind of process look like for you?
Yeah, so I started again it all started with this Malta Biennale prompt. And so I was being very specific to thinking about the plight of the migrants that are leaving, essentially the boat migrants that are leaving the North African shore, and um, looking for opportunities in Europe. So I would intentionally think of, and it was a very personal project, very subjective, but what are some of the markers of commerce in Europe? If it is about longing for a certain economic success or participating in a certain type of production. So, for instance, on the Costa del Sol of Spain, there's an enormous amount of tomato production, and it's a very successful part of the economy there. And so tomato would come into play. So if I am taking on an identity of somehow I aspire to be participate in this piece of agriculture, which is different from where I come from. And so what's a contrasting kind of feature from where I come from? Maybe it's a geographic feature. And then what are some of the barriers? There are often people are escaping um, escaping war zones and genocides and strife that's happening. And so trying to put some of those cues in of if I am a tomato, ocean waves, boat transport escaping um, violence, what does my flag look like? And then a number of those more problematic symbols are called out, that the system is self-regulating to where I can't put in, let's say, a symbolic AK-47 that is, a type of
Sure.
weapon that's trafficked around the globe and that's often kind of part of the heart of um, these this violence that's being committed, but where tomato meets boat. And I think what goes without saying, but needs to be said here, is the exciting part is it's not my boat and it's not my tomato, right? It's relying on some cultural communal. It's not equitably communal, but it's some notion of encoding what a tomato is and what a
Yeah.
boat is. And so it's very exploratory in a form finding way. It brings me back to the faces that I don't know what I'm going to get, but because the system is efficient, I can use it to find and then cull. And so for every one of these flags I'm showing, there are 40 flags that, were generated alongside them that didn't make the editorial cut for me to put into the current work.
Sure. Awesome.
Mm.
Yeah, and then like stylistically, what did there's a certain aesthetic, right, to all of the
There,
flags that
there
you've
is a
used.
certain aesthetic, and I'm actually using not only text to image, but I'm using an image as a guide often. So I'm fabricating or using. So we might have seen, looked a bit like the Ghanaian flag at some point, that I'm feeding that as part of the guide. And I, I wanted to do that to think about structure and flags. And I don't yet have a good grip on the origin of many of these flags, but they need to be, a flag needs to be read easily from afar, right? It often has very, very strong symbolic lines, demarcations. And so I'm trying to bring that in through the introduction of some real flags and then some fabricated blanks of center medallion, broad stripe,
Sure.
left and right colors. So there's an interplay between the guide image and the text. And I wonder, is that guide image also like where does that fit in? Do you have an answer for how that fits into the diffusion model? Because I'm using stable diffusions. I'm giving it, let's say, the Swedish flag and all of my prompts. So the prompts are through clip finding a location in this latent space. And that's also somehow being married. Is it almost like a blending at a low level of the noise from both of these to then alter the output?
Yeah, you can essentially concatenate the embeddings from the image and the embeddings from the text, right? So you can uh, uh, join those two together and say like, hey, this user wants an output like this text representation, but also combined with this image representation. And you would use probably the same model, right? Like a clip model or something like that to say like,
Mm,
this image representation as well. Let's concatenate those together and then run it through the rest of the pipeline.
mm, mm. So should we got a few minutes left. Why don't we,
Yeah, we should
for
play
those
around
on
a
the
little.
call, tinker around. Maybe we'll just do text to image for now, and we can think about what sort of what sort of prompt do we want to put in here. Um, Maybe I'm really jiving currently with this idea of foreign objects. So maybe we can describe something that doesn't exist but that uses language about things that does exist. So, for instance, in Roadside Picnic, there are these empties that are, let's say, two bronze discs separated by air in a urban um, in an urban street. and feel free to interrupt. We can only have one screen sharing, so Matt, feel free to interrupt. And then maybe I'll put a comma and say I want this to look photographic, maybe high quality. Um, and so I'm not going to change any of these parameters yet, but let's generate and see what we're getting. So I get a sense of what this is, an urban streetscape. So it has a direction, a location coming from this word or those two words together. It has a sense of what it means for this to be photographic, and I believe high quality often is similar, that is pointing it towards crisper, less noisy, less solid color, more shaded objects, and it's got two bronze discs. We could increase the batch size. So rather than look at one and make a deliberation about what do I want to do with this image? Do I want to keep it or not? I can increase this number, and then it really becomes quite an editorial process where I have several of these to pick from. So it's using that prompt. And maybe, Matt, do you want to take a stab at helping us understand how that one prompt didn't lead only to one image? Like it's a fairly general prompt, but it's led here to 5 distinct images that are fairly radically different in their makeup.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, right. So these systems um, are uh, I'm blanking on the word that I'm reaching for, but they're the input is not does not lead to a direct output every time,
Right,
right?
right.
So there is some noise in the process when you prompt these models.
And that
Um,
changes the way we use them, right? Less like a
yeah,
photographer where I'm situating myself very specifically, and
yeah,
more, again, working really in concert with the system where we're going back and forth, and I'm maybe going to refine my prompt based on what I'm seeing.
yeah.
So maybe I'll say 2 shiny small bronze discs separated by air in an empty, empty urban streetscape. Maybe let's say smoke and fire, which comes from roadside picnic. That there's a lot of um, atmosphere in the location that these are found. What I think was so fun about this prompt, and the students have to make a narrative of 10 images, is they need to think sequentially. It's not just about one, but they have to engage, how do I tell a story over time through a combination of images and link them in a way that hopefully they really engage deeply in this prompt engineering to create um, images that work together.
Totally. Non-deterministic was a word that I was reading about earlier.
Yeah.
Um, can you talk about, okay, so these systems are like non-deterministic, and that you can obviously like increase the batch size, like you showed. Can you talk about the curatorial process for you? What does that look like in terms of like prompting and then collecting and making decisions?
So I'm cards on the table. I'm fairly new to using this, so there's quite a bit of back and forth where I am responding, and let's say, for instance, in the flags, I'm often trying to figure out how do I insert more presence of something within the outputs that I'm generating,
Sure.
and I don't yet have a great sense of whether it's, is there more specificity in some parts of my prompts? If I say I'm centered on the South China Sea and I'm about fishing and I'm about borders and I'm about nets and I'm about warships, and I'm somehow in this kind of pan South Asian identity, um, there's viewing what comes out of it and then responding and reprompting to try to
Yeah.
focus into a flag that is not entirely mine. And it's terribly exciting because I don't know what's going to come out, and yet it's terribly frustrating because at times you want to be very specific, but that's a different project. That's not using the software. That is determining a flag by my own hand.
Totally.
So sadly, it looks like we are at the end of our allotted time. I feel like we're just at the beginning of the exploration, but I think we ought to honor the time frame that we have for this. And again, I just want to mention to those viewing, if you're a Duke undergraduate viewing this in December and November 2023, we've got this University 103 course that's running in the spring and going to keep running. And it's all about AI in many flavors. This is just one of the chapters, using it to make images and to think about where it fits into the culture of image making. And I think we're both really pleased to have had this chance to share just a little bit of that material and our interest in it with you today.
Totally. Yeah, it's been a blast. Thanks for tuning in, and thank you, Augustus, for your part of the presentation. It was awesome to watch our artists play with this new technology.